Welcome to Chapter 8. We're now up past the Introduction to Macroeconomics section. In Chapter 6 and Chapter 7 we talked about inflation, the Consumer Price Index, unemployment, GDP. These are really the building blocks for macroeconomics. And now we're going to take some of those ideas that we've learned and put them into some more complex graphs that we can do a lot more analysis with. So Chapter 8 is on aggregate demand and aggregate supply. This is really a different kind of chapter. This chapter, if you're reading along in the book, is really short. It's only like 66 or 7 pages, but the content in it is pretty tough, and it's also one of those chapters where it's just so crucial that you don't miss it. If you don't understand it, you're really going to have trouble moving forward. If you didn't understand production possibilities, frontiers, that really doesn't come back up in this class, so it would just hurt you for that period. But if you don't understand this, you're going to be in trouble for the rest of the semester. So it's really important that you read the chapter probably multiple times, pay attention to the lecture, but reading the book is going to be crucial because there's only so much you can take away from a lecture when the content starts getting really challenging. So here's basically the way we're going to be thinking about this. What we've done so far with supply and demand is we've thought about a typical market, and we thought about the quantity and the price, and we showed the supply and demand. We talked about why the equilibrium would probably occur, surpluses, shortages, and why those would fix itself. But this focus has been on one good or one service. Okay? What we're doing in this chapter is instead of looking at an individual product, we're looking at the entire economy. So the graphs that we're going to do in this chapter are going to look similar to supply and demand, but it's important that you understand that it's different from traditional supply and demand. We're no longer looking at individual prices and quantities, right? I think in the last chapter, or chapter 3, we talked about tacos being an example of a market, and there's a given price and a given quantity. Well, now we're going to talk about the entire economy. When we talk about the entire economy, there's not just one price. Okay, so this is going to be quite a bit different from supply and demand. I put that out there because there's a tendency to think that what we're about to do is just supply and demand rehashed, but it's not. It's different. It just looks similar. So instead of looking at supply and demand, what we are going to do is think about it for the entire economy. Okay? So let's see if we can think about how this would look. Instead of the quantity of an individual good, we should use the quantity of all goods and services. So what would be a measure for the quantity of all goods and services produced and consumed? Good measure of that would be real GDP. So this is all goods and services produced or consumed. All right. When we think about real GDP, we usually think about production. But we're also going to think about the total amount of goods consumed. So kind of like real GDP produced and then real GDP consumed as sort of a way to imagine two sides in the market, the producers and the consumers. And this down here is in dollars. Okay, so quantity is in dollars because we're thinking about the quantity of goods and services produced in terms of the amount of production. So for the production side here, these dollars represent the revenue for all goods produced, okay? All final goods produced, so it's $1. And then on the other axis here, instead of using price for an individual good like we would in an individual market, we're now thinking about the prices of all goods and services. So up here, we could put the price level, which I believe is how they lay it out in the book, or similarly, we could call this CPI. All right, and CPI is just one way to measure the price level. So I'm just going to use CPI when I go through this chapter and the following chapters. That's just how I choose to do it because we're all used to using CPI, and we learned how to calculate CPI back in chapter 6, so it should be fresh on our minds. All right, so what we're trying to do now is think as the price level, or CPI, changes, how does that affect the amount of real GDP produced and consumed. So that is the question that we're going to address in this chapter, and that's really the only question we're going to address in this chapter. But it's a very complex question, and it's one of those questions that really is sort of normative in a way. It's hard to know for sure what's going to happen because the world is so complicated. It's hard to isolate things down, right? It's hard to take this concept, ceteris paribus, just think about how prices affect quantity produced and consumed for the entire economy. Okay. So before we get to that, let's step back one more time and think about an individual product, just as a comparison. So let's think about, for example, let's go back to tacos, and let's think just about demand. And we said that demand is downward sloping, and we explained the law of demand. When prices decrease, people consume more of it. So when prices go down, people consume more tacos. But I want you to think about that a bit. If you're consuming more tacos, does that mean your consumption of other things is changing? And the answer is typically yes. So if the price goes down and people buy more tacos, generally, not always, but generally what this means is if they're buying more tacos, and that means they are buying less of something else. So what the law of demand is really illustrating is people exhibiting trade-offs when prices change. So if the price of tacos goes down, they buy more tacos and less sandwiches, for example. And if the price of tacos goes up, they go back and start buying more sandwiches. That's how it can look for an individual good. But if you think about it for an entire market, this can't be the way it works. Because if we're talking about real GDP consumed, if the prices go down for all goods, you can't go buy something else because everything is already in the amount of goods that you're consumed. Let me express that again. When the price of all goods go down, you can't just go off and buy something else because everything is contained in this graph, which is different here, okay? The law of demand works because when the price goes down, people buy more of tacos and less of something else. But if tacos were the only thing produced, maybe that wouldn't be possible, right? Maybe that would be different than if this was the only option you had. So when we think about all goods and services, you don't have this ability to trade off between different products. Thinking about this from the supply side is really the same sort of discussion. If we're thinking about an individual good, where here's the supply curve, okay? So just basic law of supply. Price goes up, quantity supplied goes up. So when the price goes up, production rises. But it's really the same sort of thing. If price of tacos, and remember, just thinking about an individual good, tacos in this example, when the price of tacos goes up, how are they going to produce more? Well, they're probably going to have to produce more at the expense of producing less of something else, okay? So for example, if the price of tacos goes up, they may start producing more tacos, which means they're producing fewer quesadillas. Or maybe if the price of tacos goes up, a bunch of new taco stands open, and they end up hiring the labor from other industries, and those industries' productions go down as a result. So again, we're talking trade-offs here. Since this is an individual good, if the price goes up, they can simply draw in more resources to produce more. If you think about the entire economy, again, it doesn't really work that way. If the price of everything goes up, you might be tempted to think, well, they're going to produce more. But how are they going to produce more, right? They can't just hire workers from another industry because when we're talking about the entire economy, it includes all industries already, okay? So when you're thinking about individual products, that's very different from the entire economy because with individual products, they can share resources among the industries. But when you're talking about the entire economy, there are no other resources out there. All resources are already in the economy. So if prices go up, they can't just go out there and hire more labor. The labor's already hired, okay? So let's get into it now. And here's the first thing to recognize is that when it comes to the entire economy, It's actually quite difficult. To make conclusive statements about it. So what we have instead is theories. We must rely on logic intuition and theories. We don't have a test tube, right? We have the overall economy. So if CPI goes up, it's hard to know just what's happening to production when prices go up, because there tends to be so much else going on simultaneously. So it's a very complicated story. So what we're going to do is we're going to go through some theories here, okay? So what we're about to show here is the prevailing theories on the connection between CPI and real GDP. All right? So these are theories about the way we think it works. And we can start with aggregate supply or aggregate demand. Would it really matter? Let's start with aggregate demand, okay? So aggregate demand, where that terminology comes from, as we know demand, that's thinking about consumers and how much they're willing to buy. Aggregate demand is thinking about all of the demands simultaneously, right? When you aggregate something or aggregate something, you're adding it all up. So this is like all of the demand curves added together in a sense. So what we're showing here is a graph showing the relationship between the CPI or price level and the amount of total consumption. In dollars, since we'll be talking mainly about the U.S. and these examples we'll be using dollars. And we'll call this real GDP consumed, which is kind of an oxymoron because real GDP is production, and we're going to be talking about consumption. But it's basically just all of the goods consumed, right? All of the total units or dollars worth of goods and services consumed in a given year. We'll just kind of call that real GDP consumed, just so we have a title for it. Okay? And here's what we think it looks like. We think that aggregate demand, which shows a relationship between real GDP and CPI, is downward sloping, like that. Okay? Which looks similar to a demand curve. But it's a very different thing to think about because, again, we're talking about the entire economy, not an individual good. And so what this would suggest is if the CPI suddenly jumps from, say, 110 to 120, okay? Imagine it just jumps, so it's at 110, and then suddenly it's at 120. Don't think about it as rising and rising and rising. We saw in the last chapter, I believe, that if CPI is going up, people tend to buy more goods, okay? But that's because they expect it to continue going up. What I want you to imagine here instead is it just jumps from this level to this level, okay? Overnight, it doesn't continue to rise. What this would suggest is if that occurs, the real GDP consumed might drop from, say, 19 trillion to 18 trillion. The numbers aren't really important here. It's just simply to illustrate the way this would work. So the logic here is when the prices go up, consumption would fall in real terms, and that's what aggregate demand suggests. Well, the question is why? Well, we have a few theories we're going to go over. So 3 theories, I'm pulling these straight out of the book. One is the real balance effect. All right, which is not the best name. I don't know where they got these names from. So the real balance effect is just what one of these is called. We're about to go over that. The second one they have listed in the book is the interest rate effect. And the third is the international trade effect. Okay, so that's the 3 theories that we are going to cover for aggregate demand. So we need to try to figure out why is there this inverse relationship between CPI and the amount of total consumption. And that's what we're going to take a look at now. So let me erase the board. I'll leave that graph up there since that's what we're trying to prove. And let's start with the real balance effect. Okay, so here's the question we're addressing. Why is aggregate demand downward sloping? Okay, AD from this point on means aggregate demand. So why is it downward sloping? Why do we believe that to be the case? And so the first one we just mentioned is the real balance effect. And here is the logic behind that. So let's imagine CPI changes and let's see what happens to real GDP. We're trying to see what the relationship looks like between these two products or between these two variables here. So let's imagine CPI goes up or down and let's see what happens. So let's say CPI goes down, okay? Let's see what happens. So CPI goes down, and I want you to think about how that would affect you. Imagine if prices, you wake up and tomorrow morning prices have dropped 10%, okay? They're not continuing to drop, they just have dropped 10%. And I want you to think about how that would affect you. Probably wouldn't affect everyone the same way, but for me, I think that I would feel wealthier if that happened. If I woke up tomorrow and prices were lower, I would feel wealthier. You know, I've got money in the bank. I've got $5,000 in the bank right now, and that $5,000 in the bank suddenly has more buying power, right? So it's kind of like I have more real money in the bank. All right, so that probably makes me feel wealthier. So when CPI decreases, people feel wealthier because the money they have is now worth more. And even if their salary decreases, right? Even if their salary also goes down, that wouldn't affect the money they have in the bank. That money that they have in the bank is gaining value. So even if their salaries go down with the decrease in CPI, they still end up feeling wealthier, okay? So what do people do when they feel wealthier? Well, there's 2 possibilities. They may spend more, they may save more, or they may do both. The real balance effect thinks about spending. Now that they feel wealthier, they increase spending. Or to put it another way, I was about to say they spend more money. Maybe an easier way to think about this is they buy more goods and services. All right, and kind of the reason why I made that change is maybe they were planning on spending $1,000 tomorrow. Well, if the prices go down and they still spend $1,000, that actually means they can buy more goods now, right? If they were going to spend $1,000 tomorrow either way, the fact that prices have dropped means they can now buy more stuff with that $1,000 that they spend. Okay, so they still end up buying more real GDP, more products and services. So they buy more goods and services, so as a result, real GDP consumed increases. All right? So there's the real balance effect. Again, to emphasize or to re-examine this, what's happening is when the prices go down, people feel wealthier, all right, because they've got money in the bank, or maybe they got money in a savings account or whatever. They got money at home. But when prices go down, that money gains value. All right? They feel wealthier. They end up buying more goods and services, leading to more real GDP. It would go the other way too. We could show this in terms of an increase in CPI, right? If CPI were to increase, people would now feel less wealthy. Since they feel less wealthy, they buy fewer goods and services, leading to a lower real GDP. So that is one possibility and one explanation why aggregate demand would be downward sloping. Okay, so when I ask this on the quiz or when I ask it on the exam, if I ask you why is aggregate demand downward sloping, let me just give you a quick little hint about what you need to be thinking about when you answer this, because I've noticed students don't often answer this real well. I've asked why is aggregate demand downward sloping, explain using the real balance effect, and I'll get answers where people just say stuff like, people buy more goods and services because they feel poorer or they feel wealthier. Make sure if you're addressing this question, you've got both the CPI and the real GDP in your answer. Because if I ask you why is aggregate demand downward sloping, what I'm asking you to do is explain why is there a relationship between these two goods or between these two variables. Why when CPI goes down does real GDP go up? So if you're answering that question, you have to tell me CPI and real GDP at some point in the answer to get credit. Otherwise, you're not establishing this relationship here. Okay? So that's one theory. A second theory, okay, so that would be one reason why this would result. Let's see if we can think about some other reasons. The second one is the interest rate effect. And this one's kind of the sister of the first one. These are very closely related. As the CPI goes down, people feel wealthier. Okay, so it starts out the same as the last one. Now let me ask you this. If people feel wealthier, we said that they could spend. Well, what's the other possibility? If they feel wealthier, they could instead save more money. So for example, if I've got $5,000 in the bank and I was planning on spending $1,000 tomorrow, maybe I only have to spend $900 tomorrow if prices go down, right? Tomorrow I'm planning on buying a new bicycle. I go to the store and I find out it's $100 cheaper. Well, now I've spent less, which means I have more money saved. What effect is that going to have on this market? Well, it's pretty interesting to think about. If people feel wealthier, they may spend more money. They may save more money. That's what makes this the interest rate effect, because we're thinking about saving. Now, what happens when money is saved? This is actually a really important question that we're going to spend a heck of a lot of time discussing in chapters 9 and 10. But when people save more money, they usually save it in banks. And what do the banks do with the money that's saved there? Do they put it back in the vaults and just hold on to it? Usually not. Most of the money that's saved in the bank is loaned out. Okay? So this money is loaned out and borrowed, and finally spent. And that's what happens to your money you put in the bank. Most of it is spent. Okay? So if I take $5,000 and I put it in a checking account, the bank's going to loan out maybe $4,000 or $4,500 of that, and they're going to loan it out to people who are going to spend it. Okay? So for example, somebody wants to buy a new car, but they can't afford it. They may borrow money from the bank to buy that car. Or maybe somebody's starting a new business. They borrow money from the bank to start a business. The thing is, when my money gets saved, as it is here, it still ends up being spent because the banks loan it out. Okay? Obviously, banks is not the only place to save your money. You could instead put your money in stocks. But if you put your money in stocks, it's still getting spent by someone. Basically, any way you save your money's going to end up being spent unless you just save it at your house. Okay? As long as you're saving it through a bank or through stocks or through bonds or something like that, your money will end up being spent. Okay? So since savings causes more spending, consumption increases. So real GDP consumed rises. That's the interest rate effect. All right. So again, notice I've got my CPI decreasing here. I've got my real GDP increasing here. That way I can show the relationship. One changes, the other one changes with it. That way I'm answering this question here, why is aggregate demand downward sloping? So if we take 1 and 2 together, right, the real balance effect and the interest rate effect together, what we can basically learn is when CPI goes down, people feel wealthier. And it doesn't matter if they spend or save the money. Either way, that leads to more real GDP consumed. So that helps us understand why this should be the case, okay? So that's the second effect. And let's now get to the third. Which is the international trade effect. International trade effect. Okay, the logic behind this one is that when CPI changes, let's say it decreases again. Well, what does CPI measure? It measures the price level. And it measures the price level where? If we're talking about the US, it's just in the US, right? When we talk about CPI, that's different for different countries. Mexico uses the peso, so it's got its own inflation rates. It's got its own CPI levels. Here in the US, we use the US dollar. So we've got our own CPI, which is completely different from Mexico's, okay? So here's the thing. When CPI decreases in the US, US goods are now relatively cheaper. Than foreign goods. All right, so the way this would feel is if CPI goes down right now in the US, if you went out to buy stuff, you'd realize that stuff produced in the US now is a lot cheaper. Stuff produced in other countries now is relatively expensive. All right, so it's not that foreign goods are getting more expensive, it's just relatively speaking they are. So maybe in the US we're selling, Ford Fusions for $20,000. Honda Civics are also $20,000. Well, the Honda Civic is still $20,000 once exchanged to US dollars, but now that Ford Fusion is cheaper, okay? So what would that cause people to do? It would cause people to want to buy the US goods instead of the foreign goods. So what this would cause is both foreigners and domestic consumers would both buy more US goods. Right? This is going to affect domestic and foreign consumers. Me in the US, I'm more likely to buy the Ford Fusion now. So it affects me because now I buy a domestic car instead of a foreign one. Likewise, if somebody's in Canada, they may be more likely to buy the Ford Fusion 2 instead of the Honda Civic. Okay? So basically everyone on earth is now more likely to buy US goods because the US goods are cheaper because of the CPI decrease. All right? So that's what I have so far. The last thing I need to do, just to make sure that I've got it here, is just add this last little issue. I'm trying to see why these two things are related, why there's a downward sloping relationship. So I just need to add the last sentence here. So, real GDP consumed increases. And there we have it. We've got real GDP consumed here. We've got CPI here. So I have effectively addressed that question there. Okay, and that'll do it for the first part of this chapter. In the next chapter, we're going to look at aggregate supply. Please, as I mentioned before, read the book because this is quite a challenging chapter, and it's just so important that you understand this content before we move on to the next two chapters, because this is what we're going to be using from now on. Aggregate demand and aggregate supply is our world now for analyzing how the economy operates.